The history of Saudi Arabia, as a state, began with its foundation in 1933 by Abdulaziz Al Saud, although the human history of the region that is now Saudi Arabia extends as far as 20,000 years ago. The region has twice in world history had a global impact. The first was in the 7th century when it became the cradle of Islam. The second was from the mid-20th century when the discovery of vast oil deposits propelled it into a key economic and geopolitical role. At other times, the region existed in relative obscurity and isolation, although from the 7th century the cities of Mecca and Medina had the highest spiritual significance for the Muslim world, Mecca being the destination for the Hajj annual pilgrimage. For much of its history most of the region has been controlled by a patchwork of tribal rulers. The Al Saud were originally minor tribal rulers in Najd in Central Arabia. From the mid-18th century, imbued with a religious zeal of the Wahabbi Islamic movement, they became aggressively expansionist. Over the following 150 years, the extent of the Al Saud territory fluctuated. However, between 1902 and 1927, the Al Saud leader, Abdulaziz, carried out a series of wars of conquest which resulted in his creation of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. Since 1932, Abdulaziz, and, after his death in 1953, 5 of his sons in succession have ruled Saudi Arabia as an absolute monarchy. His immediate successor Saud, facing opposition from the rest of the royal family, was replaced by Faisal in 1964. Until his murder by a relative in 1975, Faisal presided over a period of growth and modernization fueled by oil wealth. Saudi Arabia's role in the 1973 oil crisis and the subsequent rise in the price of oil dramatically increased the country's political significance and wealth. The reign of his successor, Khalid, saw the first major signs of dissent with the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by Islamist extremists in 1979. Fahd became king in 1982 and, during his reign, Saudi Arabia became the largest oil producer in the world. However, internal tensions increased when the country allied itself with the United States, and others, in the Gulf War of 1991. In the early 2000s, the Islamicist opposition to the regime carried out a series of terrorist attacks. Abdullah succeeded Fahd in 2005 and has instituted a number of mild reforms to modernize many of the country's institutions and, to some extent, has increased political participation. Pre-Islamic Saudi Arabia. There is evidence that human habitation in the Arabian Peninsula dates back to about 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. Archaeology has revealed some early settled civilizations, the Dilmun civilization on the Persian Gulf, and Thamuk north of the Hijaz. The earliest known events in Arabian history are migrations from the peninsula into neighboring areas. There is also evidence from Timna and Tel el-Kelafi that the local Quraysh Midianite pottery originated within the Hijaz region of NW Saudi Arabia, which suggests that the biblical Midianites originally came from the Hijaz region of NW Saudi Arabia before expanding into Jordan and southern Palestine. The spread of Islam. Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, was born in Mecca in about 570 and first began preaching in the city in 610, but migrated to Medina in 622. From there, he and his companions united the tribes of Arabia under the banner of Islam and created a single Arab-Muslim religious polity in the Arabian Peninsula. Following Muhammad's death in 632, Abu Bakr became leader of the Muslims as the first caliph. After putting down a rebellion by the Arab tribes, Abu Bakr attacked the Byzantine Empire. On his death in 634, he was succeeded by Umar as caliph, followed by Uthman ibn al-Affan and Ali ibn Abi Talib. The period of these first 4 caliphs is known as the Rashidun or rightly guided caliphate. Under the Rashidun caliphs, and, from 661, their Umayyad successors, the Arabs rapidly expanded the territory under Muslim control outside of Arabia. In a matter of decades Muslim armies decisively defeated the Byzantine army and destroyed the Persian Empire, conquering huge swathes of territory from the Iberian Peninsula to India. The political focus of the Muslim world then shifted to the newly conquered territories. Nevertheless, Mecca and Medina remained the spiritually most important places in the Muslim world. The Quran requires every able-bodied Muslim who can afford it, as one of the 5 pillars of Islam, to make a pilgrimage, or Hajj, to Mecca during the Islamic month of Dhu al-Hajj or at least once in his or her lifetime. The Masjid al-Haram in Mecca is the location of the Kaaba, Islam's holiest site, and the Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina is the location of Muhammad's tomb. As a result, from the 7th century, Mecca and Medina became the pilgrimage destinations for large numbers of Muslims from across the Muslim world. Umayyad and Abbasid periods, despite its spiritual importance, in political terms Arabia soon became a peripheral region of the Muslim world, in which the most important medieval Islamic states were based at various times in such faraway cities as Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. Most of what was to become Saudi Arabia reverted to traditional tribal rules soon after the initial Muslim conquests, and remained a shifting patchwork of tribes and tribal emirates and confederations of varying durability. Muawiyah I, the first Umayyad caliph, took an interest in his native Mecca, erecting buildings and digging wells. Under his Marwanid successors, Mecca became the abode of poets and musicians. Even then, Medina eclipsed Mecca in importance for much of the Umayyad period, as it was home to the new Muslim aristocracy. Under Yazid I, the revolt of Abd Ali bin al-Zubayr brought Syrian troops to Mecca. An accident led to a fire that destroyed the Kaaba, which was rebuilt by Ibn al-Zubayr. In 747, a Kharijite rebel from Yemen seized Mecca unopposed, but he was soon defeated by Marwan II. In 750, Mecca, along with the rest of the Caliphate, was passed to the Abbasids. Sharifate of Mecca. From the 10th century the Hashemite Sharifs of Mecca maintained a state in the most developed part of the region, the Hijaz. Their domain originally comprised only the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, but in the 13th century it was extended to include the rest of the Hijaz. Although, the Sharifs exercised at most times independent authority in the Hijaz, they were usually subject to the suzerainty of one of the major Islamic empires of the time. In the Middle Ages, these included the Abbasids of Baghdad, and the Fatimids, Ayyubids and Mamluks of Egypt. Ottoman era. Beginning with Selim I's acquisition of Medina and Mecca in 1517, the Ottomans, in the 16th century, added to their empire the Hijaz and Asir regions along the Red Sea and the Al-Hassa region on the Persian Gulf Coast, these being the most populous parts of what was to become Saudi Arabia. They also laid claim to the interior, although this remained a rather nominal suzerainty. The degree of control over these lands varied over the next 4 centuries with the fluctuating strength or weakness of the empire's central authority. In the Hijaz, the Sharifs of Mecca were largely left in control of their territory. On the eastern side of the country, the Ottomans lost control of the Al-Hassa region to Arab tribes in the 17th century but regained it again in the 19th century. Throughout the period, the interior remained under the rule of a large number of petty tribal rulers in much the same way as it had in previous centuries. Rise of Wahhabism and the First Saudi State. The emergence of the Saudi dynasty began in Central Arabia in 1744. In that year, Muhammad ibn Saud, the tribal ruler of the town of Ad-Diriyah near Riyadh, joined forces with the religious leader Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the founder of the Wahabbi movement, a radical form of Islam. This alliance formed in the 18th century provided the ideological impetus to Saudi expansion and remains the basis of Saudi Arabian dynastic rule today. Over the next 150 years, the fortunes of the Saud family rose and fell several times as Saudi rulers contended with Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, and other Arabian families for control of the peninsula. The first Saudi state was established in 1744 in the area around Riyadh and briefly controlled most of the present-day territory of Saudi Arabia through conquests made between 1786 and 1816. These included Mecca and Medina. Concerned at the growing power of the Saudis, the Ottoman Sultan, Mustafa IV, instructed his viceroy in Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, to reconquer the area. Ali sent his sons Chusun Pasha and Ibrahim Pasha, who were eventually successful in routing the Saudi forces in 1818 and destroyed the power of the Al Saud. returned to Ottoman domination. The Al Saud returned to power in 1824, but their area of control was mainly restricted to the Saudi heartland of the Najd region, known as the Second Saudi State. However, their rule in Najd was soon contested by new rivals, the Al Rashid of Hawil. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, the Al Saud and the Al Rashid fought for control of the interior of what was to become Saudi Arabia. By 1891, the Al Saud were conclusively defeated by the Al Rashid, who drove the Saudis into exile in Kuwait. Meanwhile, in the Hijaz, following the defeat of the First Saudi State, the Egyptians continued to occupy the area until 1840. After they left, the Sharifs of Mecca reasserted their authority, albeit with the presence of an Ottoman governor and garrison. Arab Revolt. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire continued to control or have suzerainty over most of the peninsula. Subject to this suzerainty, Arabia was ruled by a patchwork of tribal rulers, with the Sharif of Mecca having preeminence and ruling the Hijaz. In 1916, with the encouragement and support of Britain and France, the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, led a pan-Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire with the aim of securing Arab independence and creating a single unified Arab state spanning the Arab territories from Aleppo in Syria to Aden in Yemen. The Arab army comprised Bedouin and others from across the peninsula, but not the Al Saud and their allied tribes, who did not participate in the revolt, partly because of a long-standing rivalry with the Sharifs of Mecca and partly because their priority was to defeat the Al Rashid for control of the interior. Nevertheless, the revolt played a part in the Middle Eastern front and tied down thousands of Ottoman troops, thereby contributing to the Ottomans' World War I defeat in 1918. However, with the subsequent partitioning of the Ottoman Empire, the British and French reneged on promises to Hussein to support a pan-Arab state. Although Hussein was acknowledged as king of the Hijaz, Britain later shifted support to the Al Saud, leaving him diplomatically and militarily isolated. The revolt, therefore, failed in its objective to create a pan-Arab state, but Arabia was freed from Ottoman suzerainty and control. Unification. In 1902, Abdulaziz bin Saud, leader of the Al Saud, returned from exile in Kuwait to resume the conflict with the Al Rashid, and seized Riyadh, the first of a series of conquests ultimately leading to the creation of the modern state of Saudi Arabia in 1932. The main weapon for achieving these conquests was the Ikhwan, the Wahhabist Bedouin tribal army led by Sultan bin Bajid al-Otayabi and Faisal al-Duwaish. By 1906, Abdulaziz had driven the al-Rashid out of Najd and the Ottomans recognized him as their client in Najd. His next major acquisition was Al-Hassa, which he took from the Ottomans in 1913, bringing him control of the Persian Gulf Coast and what would become Saudi Arabia's vast oil reserves. He avoided involvement in the Arab Revolt, having acknowledged Ottoman suzerainty in 1914, and instead continued his struggle with the Al-Rashid in northern Arabia. In 1920, the Ikhwan's attention turned to the southwest, when they seized Asir, the region between the Hijaz and Yemen. In the following year, Abdulaziz finally defeated the Al-Rashid and annexed all northern Arabia. Prior to 1923, Abdulaziz had not risked invading the Hijaz because Hussein bin Ali, king of the Hijaz, was supported by Britain. However, in that year, the British withdrew their support and the Ikhwan attacked the Hijaz, completing its conquest by the end of 1925. On January 10, 1926, Abdulaziz declared himself king of the Hijaz and, then, on January 27, 1927, he took the title king of Najd. By the Treaty of Jeddah, signed on May 20, 1927, the United Kingdom recognized the independence of Abdulaziz's realm. After the conquest of the Hijaz, the Ikhwan leaders wanted to continue the expansion of the Wahhabist realm into the British protectorates of Transjordan, Iraq and Kuwait. Abdulaziz, however, refused to agree to this, recognizing the danger of a direct conflict with the British. The Ikhwan therefore revolted but were defeated in the Battle of Sabila in 1930, and the Ikhwan leadership were massacred. In 1933, the two kingdoms of the Hijaz and Najd were united as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Boundaries with Transjordan, Iraq, and Kuwait were established by a series of treaties negotiated in the 1920s, with two neutral zones created, one with Iraq and the other with Kuwait. The country's southern boundary with Yemen was partially defined by the 1934 Treaty of Ta'if, which ended a brief border war between the two states. Modern history. Abdulaziz's military and political successes were not mirrored economically until vast reserves of oil were discovered in 1938 in the Al-Hassa region along the Persian Gulf Coast. Development began in 1941 and by 1949 production was in full swing. Abdulaziz died in 1953. King Saud succeeded to the throne on his father's death in 1953. Oil provided Saudi Arabia with economic prosperity and a great deal of political leverage in the international community. At the same time, the government became increasingly wasteful and lavish. Despite the new wealth, extravagant spending led to governmental deficits and foreign borrowing in the 1950s. However, by the early 1960s an intense rivalry between the king and his half-brother, Prince Faisal emerged, fueled by doubts in the royal family over Saud's competence. As a consequence, Saud was deposed in favor of Faisal in 1964. The mid-1960s saw external pressures generated by Saudi-Egyptian differences over Yemen. When civil war broke out in 1962 between Yemeni royalists and republicans, Egyptian forces entered Yemen to support the new republican government, while Saudi Arabia backed the royalists. Tensions subsided only after 1967, when Egypt withdrew its troops from Yemen. Saudi forces did not participate in the Six-Day War of June 1967, but the government later provided annual subsidies to Egypt, Jordan, and Syria to support their economies. During the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Saudi Arabia participated in the Arab oil boycott of the United States and Netherlands. A member of the OPEC, Saudi Arabia had joined other member countries in moderate oil price increases beginning in 1971. After the 1973 war, the price of oil rose substantially, dramatically increasing Saudi Arabia's wealth and political influence. Faisal was assassinated in 1975 by his nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musaid. King Faisal was succeeded by his half-brother King Khalid, during whose reign economic and social development continued at an extremely rapid rate, revolutionizing the infrastructure and educational system of the country. In foreign policy, close ties with the U.S. were developed. In 1979, two events occurred which the Al Saud perceived as threatening the regime, and had a long-term influence on Saudi foreign and domestic policy. The first was the Iranian Islamic Revolution. There were several anti-government riots in the region in 1979 and 1980. The second event was the seizure of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by Islamist extremists. The militants involved were in part angered by what they considered to be the corruption and un-Islamic nature of the Saudi regime. Part of the response of the royal family was to enforce a much stricter observance of Islamic and traditional Saudi norms. Islamism continued to grow in strength. King Khalid died in June 1982. Khalid was succeeded by his brother King Fahd in 1982, who maintained Saudi Arabia Euro-unregistered trademark's foreign policy of close cooperation with the United States and increased purchases of sophisticated military equipment from the United States and Britain. Following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, Saudi Arabia joined the anti-Iraq coalition, and King Fahd, fearing an attack from Iraq, invited American and coalition soldiers to be stationed in Saudi Arabia. Saudi troops and aircraft took part in the subsequent military operations. However, allowing coalition forces to be based in the country proved to be one of the issues that has led to an increase in Islamic terrorism in Saudi Arabia, as well as Islamic terrorist attacks in Western countries by Saudi nationals. The September 11 attacks in New York being the most prominent example. In 1995, Fahd suffered a debilitating stroke and the Crown Prince, Prince Abdullah, assumed day-to-day responsibility for the government. In 2003, Saudi Arabia refused to support the U.S. and its allies in the invasion of Iraq. Terrorist activity increased dramatically in 2003, with the Riyadh compound bombings and other attacks, which prompted the government to take much more stringent action against terrorism. In 2005, King Fahd died and his half-brother, Abdullah, ascended to the throne. Despite growing calls for change, the king has continued the policy of moderate reform. King Abdullah has pursued a policy of limited deregulation, privatization and seeking foreign investment. In December 2005, following 12 years of talks, the World Trade Organization gave the green light to Saudi Arabia's membership. As the Arab Spring unrest and protests began to spread across Arab world in early 2011, King Abdullah announced an increase in welfare spending. No political reforms were announced as part of the package. At the same time, Saudi troops were sent to participate in the crackdown on unrest in Bahrain. King Abdullah gave asylum to deposed President Zine al Abidine Ben Ali of Tunisia and telephoned President Hosni Mubarak of Egypt to offer his support. See also: History of the Middle East, Kinder, King of Saudi Arabia, Timeline of Jeddah, Timeline of Medina, Timeline of Riyadh. References